Okay, so welcome everyone. We're delighted to kick off our 2016-17 season. And I will now turn it over to Danny to introduce our speaker.
Great, yeah, so you don't know Naomi, but I'll introduce her and we'll make her introduce herself. So Naomi is an assistant professor of criminology, law, and society at UC Irvine. She comes to Irvine after completing her PhD in sociology and social policy at Princeton, where she is also affiliated with the Office of Population Research. Naomi's research examines the consequences of incarceration and other forms of criminal justice contact for individuals and their romantic partners, with particular attention to how incarceration is implicated in the perpetuation of inequality. She conducts this substantively important research using innovative methods. In particular, as we'll hear about today, she is particularly interested in the use of new technologies, specifically smartphones, to address traditional methodological difficulties for studying hard-to-reach and highly mobile groups. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation as a graduate research fellow, as a doctoral dissertation improvement grant, and now as a research grant, so that, okay, I was very impressed. And has appeared in journals such as Social Problems, Social Forces, and Sociological Methods and Research. So we're delighted to have her here today to talk about daytime locations, employment, and crime after prison. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you, Liz, for coordinating my visit today. I'm really happy to be here. So today I'm going to talk, it's a little maybe unconventional, but it's kind of a three-parter. Okay, so the first part of my talk, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the Newark Smartphone Reentry Project. Because using smartphones to collect data is still fairly uncommon, particularly for hard-to-reach groups and highly mobile groups. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods of the project, the mechanics of the project, and that may be interesting methodologically to you. And then for the second part of the talk, I'm going to discuss how I've been using the GPS estimates that we've collected from the project to analyze reentry outcomes, and in this case, people's ability to find work. And then if I have time in the third part, I'm going to talk about work in progress right now, where we're trying to use the GPS estimates to come up with an idea of how to measure neighborhood, what we call social exposure, or a changing social dimension of neighborhoods, and how that relates to neighborhood level outcomes that we care about, and in this case, crime rates. Okay, so, okay, the Newark Smartphone Reentry Project. So the motivation for the NSRP started with some basic ideas back in 2009, 2010. So first of all, reentry from prison is a critical time period within the lives of many urban, Black, minority men. And so this reentry period presents lots of obstacles, and nearly 30% are reincarcerated within the first 6 months. So it's just a really critical, unstable time period. Obtaining employment is perceived to be a key factor, if not the key factor, for trying to prevent recidivism. And reentering individuals themselves state that this is their personal priority, #1 priority upon release. And also parole supervision agencies think that this is also the #1 priority upon release. So despite the importance of finding work, we already know that there are lots of barriers, right, for people who have prison experiences and criminal records. Some of these have been very well documented: the stigma of a criminal record, legal restrictions preventing you from being able to enter certain occupations and professions if you have a felony conviction, degraded soft skills and job skills when you're coming out of prison, and poor social networks or ineffective social networks. So there's lots of barriers, but even though we know a lot about these barriers, we don't really know too much about how people respond to these barriers. So how do they navigate this situation? There's not a lot of descriptive detail that we have about this really, really important 3-4 month time period in people's lives. And so one of the reasons why we have very little information is not because it's not important, right? It's because it's hard to study. So the main issue is methodological, I think. So we know that men with histories of incarceration are just simply missing from many of our commonly used data sets. And they're not missing in inconsequential numbers, they're missing in large numbers. There are reentry studies that have tried to target the reentry period by studying employment using administrative data. But we know from qualitative work that most people at reentry don't find UI covered jobs. They find off-the-books work and they find temporary positions. So then longitudinal studies have tried to address the issues with administrative data. But a lot of the surveys that have been done, with the exception of some recent ones, have really low participation rates. Just right off the bat, it's like 50% of eligible people don't agree to participate. And then they have high attrition rates over time. And this is because people with histories of incarceration are just hard to get to participate in a project in general. And then if you're trying to get them to participate during the reentry period, they just have a lot of other issues that they're dealing with, including addiction, housing instability, trying to find employment, these issues that are far more important to their livelihood than to participate in a research project, right? So ethnographies have been a really important source of information about what the reentry period is like, as well as qualitative, like small sample qualitative research. But it's just unclear how they generalize to a larger group of people coming out of prison. So within that context, smartphones seem to be a really great methodological potential solution, right, to some of these issues, especially the participation and attrition rate issue. So I thought that at the time I was trying to plan this study in 2009-2010, I thought that I might get higher participation rates because people could conveniently fill out smartphone surveys while they're going through their everyday environments without having to make time or have money to come meet me in an office to do an interview, right? I also thought that as a graduate student with limited resources, I could talk to and recruit and follow more people than I could as a graduate student, on my own, because a lot of these data collection functions are automated. And there are also a number of advantages that are related to my particular topic, right, of studying employment at reentry. So first of all, we know that people have, especially at reentry, people have day-to-day types of work. They're irregular, it's regular work, it's largely temporary, and it's really hard for people to retrospectively recall when they worked. If they're asked about it 3 months later, 6 months later. Oh, it was that day back in the spring, it's very difficult. We also know that things like social networks and geographic locations are probably really, really important to determining whether a person is able to find a job. These things also really difficult to estimate accurately. And then especially added to that, if you have an irregular, chaotic schedule, things are changing, you're in and out of contact with your friends and family, it's incredibly difficult to estimate accurately. And then also, smartphones have the ability to actually do social-based interventions. And so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I'm happy to talk about it more later. But basically, in this project, I did a peer-based text messaging group where I connected half of the people to this group in order to provide peer support and job information in real time. And then the other half received the same information, but not in a peer-based setting. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that, but there is the potential with smartphones to do these interventions, right? All these apps are trying to change your behavior, get you to lose weight, all these things. And so why can't we apply that to social science questions? So all these advantages sound really great in theory, but in practice, in 2009-2010, there was only one article in sociology about how to use smartphones, and that was among university students and faculty. And most of the projects that were out there that had been done were like 10 or 12 people, and they were not men recently released from prison, right? So basically, to plan the project, I first did focus groups and interviews with clients of employment reentry programs in New York. And people were really excited about this idea because they were going to get a smartphone, right, and a data plan. And we actually talked mostly about ways to help protect their privacy, because the privacy issues, especially with this group of people, is really, really important, right? So a lot of the ideas for our app in terms of protecting people's privacy actually came from the focus groups, which was kind of cool. Oops. So then we created the smartphone app with undergraduate students at Princeton. It was actually a fairly straightforward thing to do, which is amazing to me still. And we piloted it for 1 month with 12 people from a high-risk parole program in Newark, New Jersey. These are really high-risk people. We thought it was really successful. Everyone stayed for the 1 month, except for one person who was rearrested. So after that, we made a few modifications here and there, and then we did the full study, which is where I followed each participant, 135 people, for 3 months using this smartphone app. So this is a screen, the front page of our little smartphone app here. And as you can tell, the people got very old Motorola phones that look incredibly outdated now, but at the time they looked only mildly outdated. So you can see that there were a number of reasons though why I need to create my own smartphone application. The main one was because I wanted to be able to tie behavioral measures, so the call logs, the text logs, and the GPS estimates to survey prompts. So if you enter an area, you get a survey. If you exit an area, you get a survey. If you get a call from someone that you have never gotten a call before, you get a survey. So in the end, we didn't use the GPS prompts, although they're available in the application, but we used the call text prompts. And the code is available on GitHub, but it's incredibly outdated right now. So you would have to pretty much start over, I think, unfortunately. So I do want to briefly just address 2 questions that I always get. One, would individuals coming out of prison be willing to be tracked with the phones? Just, is this even feasible, right? This was just a basic question. And I think yes, under certain conditions. So we had a really, really in-depth, detailed consent process, the group meeting of all potential participants for that month that took an hour to an hour and a half. We talked in detail about what data we would collect, how we would use their data, the fact that we would never share their data with New Jersey Parole, and we also talked about how they could have control over their own data. So built into the smartphone app are functions where they can actually turn off and on the collection of certain data. So GPS locations, call and text logs, and surveys. And so if they felt like they needed to turn something off, they could turn it off without leaving their phone at home. Because that would be the alternative, right? Leave your phone at home or turn your phone off. Would they be able to use the phones? So this was another question I got a lot. The average time incarcerated was 4 years, so it wasn't that long, but in 2012, 4 years was actually a lot of time in terms of technology advances. And then there were a few people who had been incarcerated for a decade or more. And so for those people, I had to explain what the internet was. I mean, it was really a different situation when they came out. And so we had a number of different things that we did because even the younger people who were like, oh, I have smartphones, I've used smartphones, I'm a pro at smartphones, some of them only were really able to make a call and do text messaging. And they were not really comfortable with using the more advanced functions. So we had an optional smartphone training session. We had a practice survey that we walked through with people to show them all the different types of questions that could be asked. We had that on-call service help. I don't know if you noticed, the first button on the homepage was like, call Naomi. So that was really fun for me. And then we had survey questions that we asked about previous smartphone use, which were not helpful at all in my project, but which I later realized while talking to informatics people that you really have to be careful about the way you ask those questions so that they're useful. So in the end, we had a bunch of different surveys. we had 3 different types of automated surveys that people received on an automated basis. So they got daily surveys at 7 p.m. They got a random survey sent between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., which follows like an experience sampling survey methodology to kind of get random snapshots of what people are spending their time on throughout the day. And then they got a very, very brief survey collecting just a few characteristics about the contact that either sent them a text message or called them for the first time on their phones. They also could fill out surveys. They could start them and fill them out on their own if they had an interview or they received a job offer. And then we passively collected information such as encrypted call and text logs and these GPS location estimates every 15 minutes during daytime hours. And I just want to say about the encrypted call and text logs, encrypting the phone numbers was really, really important. And I know that I've seen some projects that don't encrypt the phone numbers, and that's really problematic because that's information about people who have not consented to be part of the project. So we did a way of encrypting that was participant specific that I can talk about later, but it's just really important to encrypt them. We're able to identify old and new numbers, and so repeated numbers, and that was primarily the thing that we cared about, so.
Encryption doesn't mean you knew the number and you stored it in a safe way. It means you never knew the number.
We never knew the number. There was an encryption code that was unique that was randomly generated when it was downloaded onto the phone. Yeah, for each participant. Okay, so the general project design was basically I did an in-person initial interview with every participant, collected demographics and other characteristics, because smartphone surveys are only really useful when they're brief. So you can't collect long amounts of lots of information, right? So we did an initial interview. I followed people for 3 months, either through smartphones or through interviews every other week. And then I did an exit interview with people at the end of that 3 months. And so the full study took place in Newark, New Jersey, from April 2012 to April 2013. 156 people participated. And 135 of those were assigned to the smartphone group and 21 to the interview group. And basically people were eligible to participate if they were male, if they were recently released from prison, and if they said that they were searching for work. And like 98% of people were searching for work, right?
What's the purpose of the 21 interview group? Are those just people who didn't consent to the smartphone, or is that purposeful?
So that was purposeful. The reason why I did that is because I wanted to make sure that I was it's such a small group, but it was helpful for me to see that we were collecting similar types of information through the surveys as I would through the face-to-face.
So it's like a mode experiment. Basically.
Yeah, it was such a small group, but I think it helped give reassurance to me as a researcher that the smartphone surveys were collecting information the way I thought they would. And one reason why it was such a small group, actually, is illustrated by the participation rates here. So you can see that the dotted line is the interview group, and only 68% or so of the people who were assigned to the interview group said, yes, I'll participate, and then actually participated, right? A lot of people say, yes, I'll participate, and then they don't come to the initial interview or something, or they get busy. And so the 68% of participation rate among the interview group actually is like right in the ballpark of typical reentry survey studies. That's what you typically get, maybe even a little less, yeah.
Did the people in the interview group get phones? You just interviewed them?
So they got phones, but at the end of their participation, which I think is why you see a lot less attrition among the interview group. Because they're like, I'm gonna hold out for my phone. And then the smartphone group, they got phones and data plans at the beginning of the study, and 89% of people who were eligible participated in that initial interview. So a really high participation rate for this group of men recently released from prison. And then you can see we did have attrition over time, but a lot of that actually happened with me trying to get them to come back for the exit interview. And so the mean participation rate was actually 9 weeks in the study. And just trying to get them to come back for the exit interview was difficult because a number of them were not in contact with their officer anymore, and so they weren't going to come back and meet me at the parole office for their exit interview. This is just another figure to show you the proportion of surveys on average that a person in the study completed on their smartphone. And we gave incentives to complete over 75% of the surveys per week, and that really paid off because people really tried to complete the majority of the surveys that they got. And then here's just another accuracy of GPS estimates. So here you can see that the accuracy range is not precise enough to pinpoint a person's location in a building, right, a particular building. It is precise enough to, in general, to locate a person to a street block or something like that. And that, for our purposes, that's like more than sufficient. And the only thing I'll say about this, in addition to, well, basically, previous studies had kind of really wide-ranging accuracy estimates. And I think that this is actually a lot better, and it shows you just how much improvement has been done in 2 or 3 years since some of those previous studies were conducted. And I'm sure now, in 2016, you may be able to pinpoint someone to a location, to a building. Okay.
Could you just explain what that means, accuracy? You mean you know where the person really is?
So so what you get is you get an estimate, a latitude-longitude estimate of where a person is, and then you get an estimated accuracy range around that. So, so some locations have a wide-ranging estimate, inaccuracy, should be called. Okay, so now so that was kind of like the methods part. How am I doing on time? Okay, and so now I'm going to briefly talk about a paper that I co-authored with Michael Lenz at UCLA, Daytime Locations and Spatial Mismatch, Job Accessibility and Employment at Reentry from Prison, and this is conditionally accepted at Demography. So in this paper, we apply the GPS data from the project. And we start with the idea that there is spatial mismatch, and that is one barrier for people who are re-entering from prison to find work. And so spatial mismatch is the idea that low-income and minority households are isolated away from areas of job growth, of relevant job opportunities, which are further away, and they are unable to get to those areas. So recent evidence largely supports the idea of spatial mismatch in general, but there are some important recent exceptions. It's less clear whether residential place and spatial mismatch matters for employment at reentry. So this is often invoked by people as a barrier, but it's less clear, I think. So there are a number of papers that have said, yes, where people live at reentry, and that is measured in all sorts of interesting ways, but where people live at reentry does matter for whether they're able to get a job. And so there are these papers that have looked at this. But there's also the idea that's also put out there that no, people are so marginalized from the formal labor market that actually these local market conditions, such as the unemployment rate, are not so important to whether they get a job. And even though there's really not much research supporting the no, the yes, the measures are, in many cases, the measures are not precise, so they don't really know residents after prison, they know residents before prison. They look at UI data, so they're not really looking at all types of work. And the paper that used a more sophisticated version of local labor market conditions, Chamberlain found the exact opposite of what you would think. So people who live in jobs-rich areas actually recidivated at higher rates than people who didn't. So throughout all of this research on spatial mismatch also, spatial mismatch is theorized at the residential level, right? And so residence is super important. Without a doubt, residence is important, and it determines where people go throughout the day. But It does not necessarily correspond to where people spend most of their time. And it may be less important for people coming out of prison because a lot of people don't return to where they used to live. They return to where there's a shelter opening or something like that, and then they go spend most of their time in the neighborhoods that they're most familiar with. So daytime locations, in this paper we're saying daytime locations and residential place, do they matter for where people find jobs, right? Are these two ideas, residential place and daytime locations, how does that affect people's ability to find jobs? And so it seems pretty obvious to say where people go matters to whether they're going to be able to find work. But there's actually a number of reasons why that's not necessarily obviously the case.
But, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
what's the scale here when you talk about where people go, you mean in terms of the state, the town?
Yeah, so people have looked at counties, they've looked at neighborhoods by zip codes, and we're going to look at census block groups. So we're going to look at small levels of geography. So there's a number of reasons why you think daytime locations might be important for finding work. People might compensate for their residential disadvantages by traveling, actively seeking out jobs-rich areas. But then there's also a number of reasons why daytime locations may actually not end up mattering too much. First of all, there's some evidence that the knowledge of where openings are is not really well known. And this is particularly the case among reentering individuals. Yeah?
So are you taking the stance that location affects jobs, but jobs do not affect location? Because that
Yes.
could be the case.
Yeah, and so that's a good important point. There's also the point where we can't, this is all based on observational data, so we can't it's possible that there's some third unmeasured factor that impacts where people spend their time and their ability to get work. So it's true.
So you take that stance.
But we're taking the stance that where people live impacts their ability to find work. Yeah.
And are these the kind of jobs that you would get in person, or are these the kind of jobs that you can get
Yes.
by responding to a Craigslist ad?
So that is a reason why we think that in our situation, and I'll get to that actually, that daytime locations may matter a lot more for people coming out of prison, because face-to-face interactions are a lot more important to get work than for higher skilled groups who are sending their resumes out, it's all virtual. Another reason why daytime locations may not be related to employment is because there are extensive search costs to traveling to look for work. And there's some research that suggests that poor people usually often travel to places that are disadvantaged to similar levels as their residents. So maybe where they're going isn't actually improving their chances in terms of accessing more job opportunities. So taken together, we think that the literature overall kind of suggests that individuals who are recently released from prison often lack relevant information about where jobs are geographically restricted, and are unable to travel to appropriate areas to find work because of the search costs involved, both financial and time. So in addition to trying to interject the idea of daytime locations in spatial mismatch frameworks, we also use a fairly novel method to measure daytime locations, right? The measurement of daytime locations is not necessarily straightforward. So probably the area that has done the most important work on this is activity-based scholarship. And so previous work that measures daytime locations largely comes from this scholarship, and it emphasizes the importance of routinely visited places. So where do you go when you go to the grocery shopping? Where do you go when you go to a dentist's office or doctor's office? One thing that's problematic about this approach is that it excludes locations that do not correspond to these categories. Most importantly, leisure, visiting friends and family. You might think that that's very important, right? As opposed to going to a doctor's office. We think that asking about routinely visited places is also particularly potentially problematic for people who have irregular routines. It also doesn't capture the amount of time that they spend in those areas. So you may only see your doctor like once every few years. You may only go grocery shop, well, I usually go grocery shopping once a week, but you know, you get my point. GPS data is increasingly being used to measure activity spaces, and the Palmer article in particular used GPS estimates to look at happiness, reports of happiness throughout different areas that people travel to. Okay, so in our project, we basically use a number of different data types from the NSRP study, and we combine it with Census Bureau information about job openings. I won't go into we create kind of pretty sophisticated measures of employment accessibility that are based on residential place and daytime locations. I won't go too much into this now, but just know that our residential accessibility measure is based on the number of estimated job openings within a 50-mile radius has a distance decay function and relevant and competition for those jobs.
So what kind of job openings are you measuring? It's
So-
not all job openings, right?
So in the ones I'm going to present here, it's all job openings, but in the paper we look at also low-skilled, low-income, and jobs that don't require college degrees.
But they include informal sector that you're actually collecting here?
No, they don't.
Okay.
So there is a disconnect between the job accessibility measures and then our outcome, which is self-reported employment, which does capture off-the-books work. Yep.
And you mentioned earlier that people had the option to turn off their GPS.
Yes. Yeah.
I would just turn my GPS off all the time.
Yes. So we have coverage for about 89% of the expected estimates. And we go into about half of the lack of coverage is due to people actively turning off their GPS from their application, and the other half is due to GPS service not working, which may be due to them turning it off on their phones, but it also could be due to spotty service. Yeah. But it's pretty high coverage, I would say.
What months are these covering? Because, you know, the summer might differ in terms of people's activity versus the winter, especially in Newark.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is from April 2012 to July 2013 was when we finished collecting data
So people are out.
for the last group. Yeah. And so we use OLS and we also use Cox proportional hazard models. But since I'm running over time, I'm just going to talk about the Cox ones, I think. So quickly, this is just a graph of estimated total job openings in the Newark for New Jersey. Newark is that darker section up there, and then proportion of daytime locations. So you can see that people are moving around, but there's not nearly as much variability. Well, there is in the Newark center only, but you're not able to see that really well with these graphs here. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this. This is just a simple aggregated association. It's not very convincing, I think. This is the more convincing model. So this is a Cox model where we estimate time to first day of work. And we have a number of control variables. And then we have a model that just includes job accessibility measures based on residential location. And then we add in job accessibility measures based on daytime locations. And as you can see, really where people go prior to getting that job is strongly and positively associated with getting a job. And so residential place does not matter in this, or is very weakly associated, not significantly associated with time to first day of work. Residential place does matter when we look at low-skilled jobs and low-income jobs. It does matter. So that relationship is a little different. But in terms of daytime locations, the relationship is pretty much consistent across all job types. So where people go previous to finding that first day of work is strongly associated.
Can you just explain what the units are and how do we interpret
Oh
1, 2, 3?
yeah, sorry. So daytime, so both of these things are standardized measures. So increase in the one standard deviation of either of these measures equals about a 30% more chance.
And the variable daytime locations is the quality of where you are in terms of job availability?
Yes. job availability and where you are for that day, kind of averaged for the whole day. And it's a running average that changes.
With regards to Marion's question, how are you interpreting this? Are you interpreting this, people want jobs, go to places where the jobs are, or are you interpreting this as somehow they randomly go there and guess what, they find a job?
So we're not able to distinguish between those two things, right? All we're able to really say is that where people go matters in terms of their employment outcomes during the day. Why does it matter? We don't really know.
But do your controls and whatever other information you have that predict where people go in terms of the quality of the place?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, actually, it's, what's actually consistent with a lot of this reentry research is if you use self-reported employment as the outcome, these controls
No,
are
I mean, do
rarely
these things
significant.
predict where people are?
Right.
Do these,
Oh, that's a good idea.
do more highly educated people go to better places? Because they kind of have that
Right.
knowledge. Or do people with mental health diagnoses go to,
We actually
but
didn't,
anyway,
no, we
yeah.
didn't test that. That's
Okay.
a great point. We actually didn't look at that. We should, for sure.
I mean, I don't think there's a wrong answer. It just
Yeah.
would maybe help distinguish between these two explanations.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
And since you have data more fine-grained, you could do it not just daily averages, but you could do it in smaller blocks.
Yes, yeah, we definitely could. There's so much that you could do with these data. You could do like, different times during the day. We actually did some stuff with day of the week. There's so much you could do. It's wonderful and overwhelming.
Yeah,
do you have a
are
question?
these participants involved in a program that will assist getting jobs?
So some of them go in and out of programs depending on whether they're categorized as risky. So that's like a sanction, is to try to get them
Do you
into a
control
job
for that?
program. So we don't hear, we should control for that, but I don't know if it would really make a difference because they usually just check in the morning and then they're free to go. They're not like,
They don't go to a
Kept
location.
there.
Yeah,
yeah, they do for a very short amount of time and then once they've proven themselves, they're able to check in and go out. And so, yeah.
So sorry, I'm just trying to understand this as well because I think you motivate some of this by the idea that where people are placed after they leave prison matters, right? So if you send people to different places, but this telling us that doesn't matter, where people will move to where the jobs are anyway. So the policy implication is they'll be fine.
Well, so there is some research that shows that where people live matters to their recidivism outcomes.
Right.
But the ones that like David Kirk is probably the most known for that. But he's looking at like huge geographical areas. So he's saying we should move people out of the state where they're used to living. Like huge movements. We're talking about where people go in terms of a census block group, where people live, and then where people go throughout the day. And so in that framework, residential place doesn't really seem to matter, at least when you think of all jobs. There are some differences. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know the sample's small, but I would estimate these two separately, the one for people who have the job training program, because that's going to be the case that the location's highly correlated with the job. Like determination of looking for a job versus people who aren't necessarily, looking for jobs explicitly. So
yeah, we can definitely control for, our sample's so small. And like I said, they go in and out of those programs, so they're really changing on like a weekly basis almost. But just anecdotally, like I said, I don't think that it really matters that much because they're not spending days and days, at least for the way the Newark day reporting program is set up. Might be different in other locations. Yeah. I hope this was clear because I feel like I did rush through it because of the time situation. But no.
We'll stop asking questions.
Yeah.
So is there a high correlation between all jobs, locations with a lot of all jobs, or locations with a lot of low-skilled jobs and a lot of jobs? Because I just don't, this doesn't seem like the right variable.
Yeah, so actually,
It doesn't pass my sniff test. I want to see that.
I will show you. Because I can't have the, so So here we go. So you can see that for low-skilled and low-income jobs, there is a relationship between where people live, but not for jobs. It's not significant, at least with no college, although the magnitude of the association is a lot higher than what you see with total jobs. So this is actually, maybe I should have presented this slide instead. One of our conclusions for the paper is actually that you do need to look at jobs that are most relevant for people coming out of prison. Because most papers look at the unemployment rate of the area. And so they don't look at job access, and when they do, it's not distinguishing between these types of, different types of jobs. But I think, as you can see, the relationship with daytime locations is pretty consistent no matter what types of jobs you're looking at. Yeah. So when do we end? Because I feel like I may not.
If you set us some up, then we can have more questions. But we have about 10
I will
minutes.
just.
Is that okay?
I just want to give one little shout out to the thing that we're working on right now. Let's see, what did I? Just quickly conclusions. We think that where people go during the day matters for employment outcomes. And we think that there's also reasons to think that residential job accessibility is less important for men on parole coming out of prison than for the general population, right? And there's a number of reasons why that may be less salient. But it's an open empirical question. Okay, so I just do want to give one quick shout out to the research that we're currently doing right now. This is co-authored work with Wade Jacobson at Penn State, who is a graduate student and who is on the market this year. And we are trying to think about a neighborhood level measure of where people are spending their time. So a lot of the neighborhood effects, neighborhoods studies look at the importance of neighborhood context on individual level outcomes. So we're trying to say where people are spending their time in different neighborhoods probably depends, probably impacts some characteristic of that neighborhood, and that those characteristics impact things we care about, like crime rates, right? And so a lot of this is not new, like theories about why people commit crime. There's a theory that people who are more engaged in unstructured socializing and loitering around a place are more likely to get into situations that make them prone to committing crime. So we're trying to come up with a directly observed measure of what neighborhoods facilitate time spent in those areas and what neighborhoods guard against time spent in those areas. And the most famous study that has tried to do that is probably Rob Sampson's systematic social observation study, where they videotaped street blocks and then coded them for whether there was the presence of an adult in the videotape, whether those people were fighting or arguing, and trying to code activity based on that. In this paper, we use the GPS estimates and we combine them with people's real-time reports of what they're doing. So we know kind of what they're doing when they're in certain neighborhoods. And then we're trying to map certain neighborhoods or areas as more conducive to working, more conducive to not working and not searching for work. And then we look at how those things are related to crime rates at that census block group level. And we find that if people are not working and not job searching, there's a relationship, a strong positive relationship with crime rates. And when people say that they're working in a neighborhood, there's a small and non-significant association with crime rates. So that's that paper. And that's the idea, and it's been a struggle. So I appreciate any thoughts you have on that, but I know I didn't really go into it very much. So anyways, thanks so much, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion and answering your questions.
Our format here is we try to get the speaker to finish a few minutes before 1, because some people have to leave at 1, but we can take, if you have to leave at 1, go ahead and go to your class, but we're trying to probably have about 10 minutes or so.
Yep.
So you made a decision
distinction between where people live and where they spend their time, but I wondered how much those kind of intersect and whether people are residentially unstable and living in multiple households. Yeah, so, you know, on its face, it's a simple question, but when you get into the mechanics, it's complicated. So we have a single point in time measure at the beginning of the study of where people say they live. And there is overlap, but actually, I don't have the graph here, but for some people, where they say they live, they actually spend 90% of their time in that census block. But for most people, it's about 40–50% of their time, so it is like a high degree of overlap, but they're still spending like 50–60% of their time not in that area. And then there's a group of people, about 10–15%, who don't spend any time in that area. And that aligns with people who have done qualitative work, asking reentering individuals to map out where they go and where they spend their time. There's a group of people who never mention their self-reported residential address. So it really varies, you know, between people. And I would imagine over time, but we don't look at that. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what about the call log data and the sort of ability to look at, you know, who's calling you and who are you texting, and can you draw some inferences about, I don't know what, I mean, it's anonymized, but is there some clever test you have to talk about social networks and job finding there?
Yeah, so this is like my main project that is taking me years. So basically, I'm trying to figure out a way to measure closeness and tie strength and stuff like that using these call logs. And there are some ways that people have done it in the past, just like how many times you get a call, how long the calls last for. But in my case, I also have information from these surveys, because we prompted people to fill out surveys, right, about these. And we also collected information about people's social networks in the initial interview. So I have a bunch of different types of data, and I'm trying to understand closeness and these ideas of tie strength in a dynamic framework. Because these things really, the qualitative research in reentry shows that these things really change. Who someone perceives to be close to is a characteristic that really changes over time, especially during the reentry period. And I'm trying to come up with a way to measure that change and distinguish between just not calling too often and then some like underlying change in closeness. So I know that that's really vague, but I hope to work on the call log data, because I think that is the most interesting data actually. Yeah.
So I know your research is not designed to answer this, but it raises the question of what is the causal effect of having a phone, and what is the causal effect on these former prisoners of, at the moment they leave, already being part of something. Your study, I'm sure these surveys are, I don't know what it says. Have you looked for a job today? I don't know if it says that, but I mean, they're part of something that must be, I would guess, very positive for them.
Yes. So just, you know, I think that there are definitely some effects of providing a phone with a stable phone plan and then asking people whether they worked for pay that day and whether they searched for work. I don't know how much it actually matters on people's employment outcomes though, because trying to find a job is so difficult. And even though we ask every day, did you search for work? The people pretty much for the last 2 months of the studies, we only followed them for 3 months. The last 2 months of the study, very few people say I searched for work. So they've already dropped out of the job search process. So I don't know if it's necessarily asking them every day is really changing behavior in a measurable way. But we asked in the exit interview, among those who participated in the exit interview, do you think participating in this project changed how you look for work and whether you found work? We asked 2 different questions. And the majority of people said yes, and gave all different reasons for why they thought it was, why they thought that was true. And then almost the exact same percent of people in the interview group said yes. I think it changed how I look for work for all these reasons, you know? So I think that you have to imagine that it changes in some way, but how it does and whether it's really meaningful is still an open question. And actually, I hope that my next big project will randomize who gets a phone, who doesn't get a phone, who gets this level of service with the application in terms of job leads and peer support, and randomizing that level of service.
So what fraction got a job in 3 months?
So about 80, I think it was like 78 or 80% worked for pay over that time, but only like 40% worked for pay for 2 days. So a lot of people worked for pay for 1 day. If you look at 2 days, and then if you look at 3 days and 4 days and 5, and it drops off dramatically. About 10% of the sample, I think it was less than 10, because it was 11 people found consistent work. But all the other people who do not find consistent work, they are working. They're just, working 2 or 3 days, so maybe it doesn't count for much, but for them, when they talk about it.
When you say 2 or 3 days, you mean over the whole period?
Over the 3 months.
That's it?
When they talk about it though, like, for some people they remember it, some people don't until you say, oh, but I thought you were, oh yeah, I painted that house, or I did that fence job, I did that thing for my uncle or something like that.
And if you think about the effect sizes on, say, the number of days that they worked, and what are we talking about? Sort of standard deviation of a difference in the type of neighborhood where they're spending their time.
So say that again? Sorry.
So I'm trying to think of the effect size on the number of days that they're working, for example.
Okay.
And you were showing time to
Yes.
first
Yes.
job.
So the OLS model considers number of days worked.
Okay.
Yeah, over time. And so for proportion of days worked over the study period.
Okay.
And so in that, if you look at just proportion of days work in relationship between residential place and daytime locations, well, it's basically the same idea where residential place is not associated with proportion of days worked, and where people spend time is, and it's like 0.1, something like that.
So sorry, 0.1 meaning a standard deviation
Yes.
difference in
It's
the neighborhood where they're
related to
spending their
proportion.
time will increase days worked by
I
0.1.
think it's like 0.9, yeah.
0.9.
I mean 0.09, sorry.
Okay, and how does that
can
compare
show
to
you.
say the job placement programs? Such
These
as
job
those have
place- yeah.
zero effects.
These job placement programs, it's like, first of all, very few collect data on whether they've placed a person in a job. They're trying to change that, so some of the contracting providers now collect data on placing a person in a job, and it's like, if they've signed an agreement to work, then they count that as being placed. Whether they actually got paid and did a day's work is very highly,
I mean, if you were to think about working with the corrections folks and designing some kind of intervention, and could you actually identify types of places where people are going to relatively frequently and say, okay, this job placement program, I'm going to purposively put it in a certain neighborhood. I'm going to make sure that the parole officers are actually in these neighborhoods where there are a lot of jobs. So you're actually trying to direct people to these places,
and
right?
they do that. They definitely do that. I mean, there are, at least in Newark, what I've been reading is that it's very geographically varied. But in Newark, the labor market is such that there are employers who are very, very willing to hire people who are coming out of prison. And there's employers who actually benefit in a lot of ways from hiring people who are coming out of prison. They hire them for 1 or 2 days. And it's not a job in any kind of, we would never imagine this to be a job. It's for a temp agency, it's for waste management that have contracts with halfway houses, where they get a little benefit if they hire someone who's living in a halfway house. As soon as you leave the halfway house, you are let go, right? So warehouse work, these employers are willing to hire people who have felony convictions, and they actually are benefiting from the fact that they can hire this kind of expendable pool of people who just kind of rotate around. But those are not the jobs that we want people to get that are going to prevent recidivism. So that question is a whole different question.
But can you use your data to try to estimate what types of places you could actually be nudging people towards spending their time in because of the things that they're required to be doing as parts of...
Could I use this data, or could you use smartphones in general?
Well, your data or the next project, right? Think about designing the next project so you know something more about where these people are being nudged to go. And if you know sort of ex ante where the parole officer is located, et cetera, you could use this some kind of an instrument, potentially in order to look at some of these sort of more causal estimates.
And actually, so in this project we did, we were thinking about job leads, but in work that I'm doing in Orange County right now, we're really trying to think about what types of job leads we're sending people, where the jobs are, and then trying to see if people are following the job leads, right? So that's one way we're trying to kind of nudge people by the types of jobs we're sending people. But yeah, there's lots of great, really fascinating things you can do with smartphones. I think the possibilities are really endless, and exciting to see what people do with them.
Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.